And we're back to the Roman Empire, talking about our modern economy and where it came from, the global economic system. Basically, um, somewhere around 500 years ago, even though the world was still quite a bit divided, um, more and more there was a global economic system that resulted. We call this uh, the world system. And so the global economic system is derived from European colonialism, which was designed using European economic models. It's coming out of Roman rule of Europe. It's a European dominated um, system. Of course, around 100 years ago in the around 1920, by that time, European empires controlled the entire world, with a few exceptions. Pretty much Africa, Asia were totally controlled by European countries, and Latin America was heavily influenced by the United States. So we can see that there was a system in place dominated by Europe. Where did Europe come from? Europe came from the collapse of the Roman Empire. So prior to Roman conquest, Europeans were tribal. There were some chiefdoms throughout the area. The Romans conquered through Spain, France, and Germany, um, and all the way up to the British Isles. Never really penetrating very deeply during the period of Western Roman rule. Of course, the Western Empire collapsed very early on, around 500 CE, the Common Era. 1500 years ago, the Eastern Roman Empire lasted for another 1,000 years, but the Western one was the one that was controlling this part of Europe. And so when it collapsed, then that plunged um, the rest of Europe into Western Europe into um, well, for a while the development actually continued, and people continued to live as Romans, even in places like Britannia, which were never really that heavily colonized by Rome. It was too far away. But even after 500, after the Germans had destroyed Rome, had sacked Rome, even then people were still in um, um, living in these Roman style villas, which didn't make much sense in Great Britain. Of course, it's cold and wet up there, but they were open courtyard, and they were reclining to eat, and they had fountains and stuff like that. Up until around 800, 900, they were still sort of living the dream there, trying to keep civilization alive. um, so some cities developed in the Western Europe, but the economies were never very developed until after the fall of Rome, when development actually continued. I mean, it's completely different in the African colonies, which were previously civilized. There are great civilizations along in here, very powerful states, of course, and the same in Asia and Greece. But in Europe, we had a manorial system. Basically, the Romans are coming in and they are defeating the tribes living here, the tribes and chiefdoms, and they're doing so using the Roman army. The Roman army is built up from these kinds of tribes out here. Basically, these are if you've watched Gladiator, this is the backstory um, to Russell Crowe, who has a villa down here. Even though he's fighting in Germany, and then he finds out that his villa is being taken over by the state, and he rides back on two horses, but he doesn't get there in time to save the life of his family. Where did he come from? Most likely, I would say he came from Central Asia. This is where horseback riding was invented, and a lot of these tribes were taxed tribute. They were required to provide a certain number of slaves every year. These were young men, young boys. Sorry, 6, 8, 9 years old, given over to the Roman Empire. The Romans take them, put them into academies in Rome for military training. They're taught to read and write. They're taught fighting skills and economics and everything else that they need, and then they are drafted into the army at 16 or or whatever, and they serve for 20 years. And once they get out, then they're retired soldiers. And if they retire as a sergeant, they get a gold coin. And if they retire as a colonel or a major, equivalent ranks, sort of in the mid officer, then maybe they get enough to buy a restaurant or a hotel or a small farm. And if they make it all the way to general, then they get a villa. And this is what we can say Russell Crowe, he's called the Spaniard, but he probably doesn't know where he came from, or it's so far back. But he's been living in Spain because he put his 20 years in, retired at 35. With his villa, got married to a local woman, daughter of a chieftain or something like that, a chieftain in Hispania, and then he was sort of requested to come back by the emperor. Said, "Hey, you're such a great general, come and help me." So now he's in his 40s or 50s or whatever, and he's back fighting again. Even though he's basically retired. And then he gets sold into slavery down in Africa, and then he works his way back to Rome as a gladiator. Watch the movie, it's a great movie. In any case, manors in the provinces were given to Roman political and military leaders as a reward for their service, and they were given alongside the labor of the people living around them. So the people living around there are slaves, basically. We would call them peasants, but they're tied to the land. They cannot leave. They have to stay and work. But in return for that, they get a share of the crops produced to eat and keep themselves alive. So that's where that's how the economy is working. Manorial lords under Rome became assimilated into tribal and chiefly hierarchies after Rome fell. Basically, what happens is the Rome is held together by its roads, and its roads transport its army. So the army is not really, for most of the Roman Empire, it's not really focused on the conquering land. That was done pretty quickly. It's mainly on maintaining order. So it's kind of like a highly mobile police force, and very effective. And once those soldiers stop getting paid by the central state, then they're not going to keep protecting the legitimate economic activity. They're going to start preying on it because they're armed and trained in fighting. So now you've got brigands working for themselves, and you've got guns for hire. So the first thing you do when the army stops being paid is you arm yourself to protect yourself, to protect your manor, which is very open. It's open on one side, and it's got open courtyard, and it's very little defenses, because it is there during peacetime. There's no threats to it. But then once we have threats to it, then we build walls around it, and we arm ourselves, and eventually hire mercenaries to protect us from roving brigands. And then eventually we get even bigger walls around our manor, which is now basically a small castle, and defend ourselves from attacks from the neighboring castle. There's massive, intensive violence taking place back and forth throughout the Middle Ages between one king and another king, or one duke and another duke. So the earls down in the valley are fighting against each other, and eventually the duke steps in and says, "Look, I am up on the mountain. I have a much bigger castle. I have a much bigger military force. I will come and destroy both of you unless you swear fealty to me and pay me 20% of your cut." And so whatever the guys in the valley are getting out of their peasants, they have to kick it upstairs to the guy on the hill. And eventually the king down in the capital looks at that duke and says, "Hey, I've got a much bigger army than yours. I will come and destroy you unless you kick up 20% to me." So it's just a game here at this point, and that's what we call feudalism. Christianity is tying society together loosely, maintaining an alternative ownership structure to the kings and lords based around monasteries. But under feudalism, land that does not belong to the church belongs to the crown. The system based on land tenancy. So the king owns the land legally, but the lords are permitted to control it in exchange for military allegiance. So the lords have to give, they maintain these standing militias, and they have armories and all the rest. And when there's a war, when the nation or the state is under threat, then they have to contribute knights and infantry and archers and all the rest to defend the king. And in return for that, they get to keep a share of the annual crop. The serfs are the workers who raise the crops, and they're permitted to keep a portion of the crop to eat, whatever keeps them fed, in exchange for their labor. So incredibly rich soil, you're going to keep about 5%. Much more meager soil, you maybe keep 40%. Whatever it takes to feed you. European feudal society is the result here. We have primogeniture. Primogeniture is a law that only the eldest son has to inherit the entire estate. Now, oh goodness, we're at 10:40, so I will talk about primogeniture next.